There's a devil laughing in the details. Every story has a gremlin in the works. Or out of it. Tales have a habit of growing tall like grass. As time wears on, details get lost in the undergrowth or disappear into the ether. Within a few decades, the truth can transform into a completely different, but interesting story. Such is the bizarre case of the American farmer, David Lang. In the corpus of the United States folklore, the story of David Lang stands the tallest and most persistent. Every American has heard some variety or mutation of the story, even if they do not know it. The basic premise is this. A man vanishes into thin air. Literally into thin air. Despite several people watching, the subject simply ceases to exist. He is declared dead, and the conundrum never solved. But did it happen? The disappearance, that is. David Lang is one name synonymous with the tale, but so are Orion Williamson and James Byrne. Or maybe they are one and the same? The event, all the same, supposedly occurred in Tennessee in the 1880s, or maybe the date is too a product of fiction distorted to fact. In this case, reality vanishes alongside Lang. The devil laughs all the same. How many times did David Lang venture across his field until repetition created reality? Oddly enough, the lack of an answer vanishes too, into Mexico and out of history. The odd case of David Lang is always this. In Gallatin, Tennessee, on September 23, 1880, a man crosses his field. He is going across the lane to check on his horse at pasture. The man's wife and children are on the porch, but only the wife, known as Emma, is paying attention. Down the lane, a carriage is coming with two visitors, Judge August Peck and his brother-in-law. The man, David Lang, waves to the two passengers as they approach. Right as he reaches the pasture, the man vanishes. In fright, Judge Peck and his brother-in-law stop the carriage where Lang no longer is. The wife, with children in tow, runs out to find her husband. The five individuals fan out across the lane, field, and barn to recover David Lang. They check for a sinkhole or mirage, but find none. David Lang never reemerges. The marshals are summoned to help hunt for him, but despite their efforts, find nothing. In the following months, sporadic searches occur but still find nothing. There is no more David Lang. That is until, one night in 1881, Sarah and George Lang venture out to the pasture to investigate. There they find an odd patch of grass, in the exact place where their father vanished. The two find an overgrown or dead patch of grass. Accounts differ on its exact state. All versions attest it was perfectly silent though. No animals, not even the family's horses, would enter the 10 or 15-foot patch. A perfectly symmetrical area of absolute quiet. When young George put a grasshopper into the area, it remained silent until it jumped out. All placed exactly where David Lang had disappeared. Desperate for any sign, the children call out into the circle, and their father responds. Terrified, the two children flee from the distant voice. They run back to their mother and housekeeper inside, both of whom venture out to inspect the oddity. Emma recalls, a few months prior, she too heard her husband's voice when hanging laundry. She calls out to the 10 or 15-foot circle and hears him, and nothing more. A few weeks after, Lang's voice fades into silence. The overgrown or empty patch of grass remains though. He never again responds from wherever he is, or was. After a few more years, the Langs move away. No one purchases the property nor finds David Lang. The property, house, field, and pasture are left to rot. Very few in Gallatin ever again recall David Lang. He is totally lost. Still, the spot in the grass remains silent and seemingly cursed. Most versions of the tale cut the odyssey of the Langs there. Why ruin a good spooky story? Why give an ending to a perfectly good tale? Because it is the end that puts it all into question. Well, the mystery novelist Stuart Palmer would be the one to crack the case. In 1931, Palmer sought out the now aged Sarah Lang. In the July 1953 issue of Fate magazine, Palmer published his interview with Sarah Lang. Sarah told him Emma had died of depression from her loss, and George had either drifted off or died in the war. In hopes of finally finding her father, Sarah had developed an interest in spiritualism and seances, seeking to make contact with her deceased family on the other side. In April 1929, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Sarah received an answer. Taking a pencil and paper, she transcribed a message from her deceased mother. Emma's spirit wrote upon the paper, "Together now and forever, after many years, God bless you." A note transcribed directly by a ghost. A bit fortunate, is it not? It seemed the Langs had found rest. Sarah had the note confirmed by a handwriting expert, and her and Palmer signed an affidavit confirming it on October 30th, 1929. Wait, so why did Palmer wait to publish the story until 1953, 24 years later? It turns out the handwriting, note, and affidavit were signed by one person. Who? Stuart Palmer. To add to it, the affidavit was undated. An actual handwriting expert confirmed the forgery. Well, a compelling story, that was all it was. A story. One not even original to Palmer. So, what happened to the Langs then? Nothing. Nothing because they were not real. There never was a David Lang to disappear. The whole affair gets kinda complicated. Gath Hassam has an extended breakdown on the whole story on anomalyinfo.com. This video, though, is more about the mystery behind the David Lang urban legend. A tale as bizarre and impenetrable as the man's impossible disappearance. Impossible because it never happened. There never was any Langs in Gallatin, Tennessee, nor was there ever a Judge August Peck. Now, it was not impossible the census could have missed the Langs, this was 1880 after all, but Gallatin County has no evidence a Judge August Peck ever existed. The omission of a judge from public records is a big omission. That is an issue. Now, there was a Colonel David Lang in the Civil War, from Florida, but he never vanished. So, did anyone really cease to exist? Beside the people who are pure fiction. In October 1976, Robert Forrest and Bob Rickard investigated the story for the British magazine Fortean Times. The tall tale of the vanished David Lang had been published in several more magazines through the 50s and 60s across the Atlantic. These editions mixed the details and dropped the seance angle, but were generally the same. The only thing that substantiated the story was its circulation. Forrest and Rickard contacted Herschel G. Payne at the Public Library of Nashville. Payne checked the census, pulled up newspapers, and contacted historians, but could find neither hide nor hair of the Langs or the story in any newspaper. So Stuart Palmer invented the entire scenario? Well, no, it gets more complicated. The exact descent of the story is highly debated. If there were no Langs or spontaneous disappearances, where did Palmer get the story from? Partially made up, partially plagiarism, and partially folklore. Maybe. All the theories about its origins are conjecture. Palmer's version, though, was eventually retracted as complete fiction many years later. How it became to be about a farmer in Tennessee is somewhat of a mystery. One theory attributes it to a Tennessee local named Joe Mulhattan, or Joseph M. Mulholland, a man who did live in or near Gallatin. The issue? Mulholland may also be fictional. Tradition, in the South, attributes the origin of the tale to Mulhattan, who conjured the story during a line contest. Entertainment was at a premium in the South during the 1800s. Even if the tall tale-teller was a tale himself, someone did pen similar stories for Southern newspapers under the pseudonym Orange Blossom. If this was actually Mulhattan, or Mulholland, is unknown. So was it Mulholland's story? Likely not, but it cannot be completely proven or disproven, just like Mulhattan's own questionable existence. Someone edited the details. There is a story and explanation a bit closer to the source, though. By the 1970s, other authors were claiming the disappearance was real, but David Lang was not. The event was attributed to a man named Orion Williamson, an occurrence supposedly vouched for by a mysterious Dr. Maximilian Hearn of Leipzig. Once again, no one can either prove or disprove Mr. Williamson or Dr. Hearn's existence. The exact same circumstances as Mulhattan. No one has been able to find either in public records, though, so where are Orion Williamson and Dr. Hearn from then? Both names appear in the October 14th, 1880 Sunday supplement of the San Francisco Examiner titled Whither? As Mr. Williamson and Dr. Hearn of Leipzig, alternate renditions of the same names, featured in a series of 3 small articles about odd disappearances. All 3 are fictional. The first tale tells the tale of a slave owner named Williamson in Selma, Alabama, who, one day in 1854, disappeared crossing a field in front of his family. The second is about an Englishman named James Byrne who vanished running a foot race. The third is about a boy named Charles Ashmore who disappeared one night. All that remained of him was a trail of footsteps that ended abruptly and a fading voice calling out to his family. All 3 sound a bit familiar, don't they? News of the day, after all. The section ended with a statement by Dr. Hearn of Leipzig. The good doctor attributed the disappearances to a luminiferous ether that entrapped people. The very fictional Hearn said this ether removed people from time and space, which caused them to fade away. So are Orion Williamson and Mr. Williamson, or Maximilian Hearn and Dr. Hearn the same? Maybe, probably. It is unknown where the later versions of these characters got their first names from, but that is what they are. Characters. Stories from the pen of the American author Ambrose Bierce, the man who indirectly invented David Lang. The reason these three tales may have inspired the Lang legend is because they were not overtly fictional. The trilogy would later be anthologized in Bierce's corpus under the name An Unfinished Race, James Byrne, Charles Ashmore's Trail, Charles Ashmore, and the precursor to The Vanished Farmer, The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, Williamson. All three short stories written by Bierce in a journalistic style to possibly prank the public. In varying degrees, the three would be the basis for the later legends of David Lang, Orion Williamson, and the English myth of James Warson, who disappeared running a foot race. All three characters are variations of Bierce's fictional articles, all published in 1880. The trilogy would be collected in Bierce's 1893 anthology, Can Such Things Be? Who was Ambrose Bierce then? Once regarded as one of America's finest authors and horror legends, Bierce's reputation has faded since his disappearance in 1914, but never truly died. Born in Ohio on June 24, 1842, Bierce made his living as an author and journalist. In 1861, he enlisted in the American Civil War, where he suffered a head wound at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, a wound that may have caused Bierce's later famous cynical and misanthropic personality. After the war, Bierce worked as a journalist, and after 1881, was often featured as a columnist at William Randolph Hearst's newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, where he published most of his short stories, including these. Today, Bierce is mostly remembered for these horror stories, his most famous being an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge about the bizarre execution of a Confederate saboteur. Beside his newspaper tales, Bierce wrote such works as Chickamauga and longer books such as The Devil's Dictionary, originally titled The Cynic's Word Book, a cynical lampoon of the dictionary. Nearly all his work dealt with morbid and dark themes, such as murder, vanishings, and the occult. Bierce's articles are the most likely source for the Lang legend then. All the varieties of the disappeared farmer myth seem to derive from the difficulty of crossing a field. The Lang story directly lifts the plot, and the Orion Williamson version has the same last name. The only difference is transporting location from Selma, Alabama to Gallatin, Tennessee at a later date. Why the alteration? Either to avoid direct plagiarism or Joe Mulhatton's doing to set the story in his hometown. Either way, Bierce was the story's innovator, if not its outright creator. David Lang was just a colloquial adaptation of The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, and Charles Ashmore's Trail, all Bierce's writings on the bizarre. David Lang is all Bierce's work, if indirectly. Why? It was probably intended. There was a reason Bierce was called the Laughing Devil. He enjoyed fooling people. His stories were written in a journalistic style. They featured exact time, date, and places with intricate details. This made them pretty convincing for the 1880s audience. When someone saw them in a newspaper, they might not have known it was fictional. These short stories would be repeated as fact by the casual reader. Bierce got a kick out of this. So the story ends there then? The devil played his trick? Bierce invented the Lang tale that slowly became urban legend. Nobody ever disappeared into thin air? No. Bierce might have become a victim of his own fiction. The writer's fate too became legend. Nearly 25 years later, Bierce would depart from Washington, D.C. for Mexico. The mysterious fate of the fictional farmer he had created would follow him there. 70 years old, the asthmatic Bierce planned to join Pancho Villa in northern Mexico. There, he would observe the Mexican Revolution as a journalist and acquire new material for his fiction. Bierce told his secretary, Miss Christensen, he planned to continue onward to South America afterwards if possible. He promised to write letters on his journey when he was available. These letters are the last thing that give a clue to his fate. On October 2nd, 1913, Bierce departed Washington by train. His journey would take him through Shiloh, to New Orleans, to Laredo, to El Paso, and into Mexico. Ambrose Bierce planned to meet the Mexican revolutionary, Pancho Villa, and his militia in Chihuahua. Despite his pronounced intentions, many feared Bierce had left for Mexico seeking death, a fear not helped by the final few letters he wrote to his niece Laura. one closing with the classic Biercean statement, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up and shot by a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." The devil would have the last laugh, as always. Thanks to Miss Christensen's notes, Bierce's exact route and stops from Washington to Chihuahua are known. He stopped at 2 places of note to his disappearance. Shiloh to mourn his dead comrades, where he supposedly sat in the sun all day contemplating the graves of the battlefield, then in Texas where he stopped at a hotel, and probably Laredo to store a manuscript. One he planned to retrieve when he returned to the United States in late 1914 or 1915. Bierce's route ran from Washington, D.C. to Chattanooga, Chattanooga to Murfreesboro, Murfreesboro to Nashville, Nashville to Johnsonville, Johnsonville to Shiloh, Shiloh to Pittsburgh Landing, Pittsburgh Landing to Corinth, Corinth to New Orleans, New Orleans to San Antonio, San Antonio to Laredo, Laredo to Juarez, Juarez back to El Paso, then El Paso to Chihuahua. After Chihuahua, he vanishes, later movements only attested by hazy and half-forgotten word of mouth from locals. His letters give the implication Bierce intended to commit suicide. The actual truth is debatable. The theory has evidence for and against it. Bierce stopping at Shiloh is very much a habit seen in the old suicidal soldier. But why not commit suicide on the bloody grounds of Shiloh then? Why hike all the way to Mexico? Bierce's itinerary was also extremely well thought out. There's also the manuscript Bierce stored at a hotel in Laredo, one he intended to retrieve in 1915, but as he never reemerged, the manuscript vanished. Its actual contents and existence are hotly debated. Many believe it was an exposé on Bierce's former employer, William Randolph Hearst, the mogul who owned the San Francisco Examiner and many other newspapers. A tantalizing conspiracy, but if Hearst was involved in Bierce's disappearance is unknown. Bierce's disappearance itself is a topic of fierce historical argument. There are 3 theories. 1. He never reached Chihuahua. A common belief is Bierce traveled to the southwest alone to commit suicide. He either died at Laredo, Juarez, or trekked all the way up to the Grand Canyon, where he shot himself. As Bierce often remarked, he would like the Grand Canyon to be his tomb. One issue with this theory is Bierce's final letters were posted from El Paso and Chihuahua. Granted, he could have had someone else send them or simply left for the Grand Canyon after Chihuahua. The issue is no body resembling Bierce has ever been found. Even if he washed away in the Colorado River, some of his possessions or corpse would have turned up. Nothing has, not that I can confirm anyways. The second theory is Bierce died running with Viha's army. This is the most likely conclusion. Word of mouth and anecdotes confirm an old reporter was reported to be among the force. One story even claims Bierce joined the action. He grabbed a rifle and shot clean a federal troop. For his effort, Viha's forces awarded the old American with a sombrero. Bierce did want one last great adventure after all. It's likely Bierce was either killed in the conflict at Chihuahua or later assault. After Chihuahua, Viha's forces besieged a federal arsenal at Ojinaga. If anywhere, Bierce likely died in the assault there and was buried in a mass grave, though according to the dentist Adolf Danziger de Castro, an associate of H.P. Lovecraft, who supposedly visited Pancho Villa in 1928, Villa claimed he had Bierce executed. The Caudillo, according to the not very reputable word of Castro, had the American journalist shot for insolence. Either way, Bierce most likely vanished among the dead at Ojinaga, an unmarked casualty of revolution. The third theory finds more proof in folklore rather than reality. The story that Ambrose Bierce is buried in Marfa, Texas. According to word of mouth, Bierce, incredibly sick, escaped with Mexican forces for the border after Ojinaga. Bierce, sick with pneumonia, was picked up by a group of Mexicans who were able to carry him across the border. Barely able to talk, they only learned the American was named Ambrosia and had written a book with devil in the title. Bierce, unconscious, was delivered to a Red Cross hospital where he died. Supposedly, an unmarked gravestone found in Marfa designates the forgotten burial ground of Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce. That's the legend anyway. Take it as you will. Or maybe he evaporated into South America to become his last great disappearance. Today, Ambrose Bierce's disappearance is numbered among the unsolved cases of David Lang and Orion Williamson, funnily enough. Fiction and fact sit side by side due to Bierce's sense of humor. There is as much difficulty in crossing revolutionary Mexico as there is in crossing a field. Colors of the Lang case have even worked their way into the accidental author's very real vanishing. The question is, did Bierce set out to become an example of his own stories, or did the strength of myth make him one? Then there's the question of David Lang, the composer, not the farmer. Lang has written/composed a piece of musical theater titled The Difficulty of Crossing a Field. Of course, he is not the subject of the play. That's the disappearance of the farmer Williamson, an ironic twist of fate to have a Lang produce a musical out of Bierce's short story. Anyone asked Lang if he knows where Bierce is? Repetition has made David Lang into reality, and fiction has blurred the face of Ambrose Bierce. I do think Bierce would have gotten a perverse pleasure that his work is still fooling folks 100 years later, either as creepypastas or musical compositions. The greatest trick he ever pulled. The devil, after all, always laughs the loudest.